Red was a nocturnal person, a people person, and a club person. So he's used to Vegas and all that, and he was used to live audience. Well, we rehearse all week without an audience until the final day when we tape.
At 87 years old, Hal Williams has quietly become the last living bridge to one of television's most legendary eras. But after the death of Demond Wilson on January 30th, 2026, something unexpected happened. Fans began asking questions about what really went on behind the scenes of Sanford and Son, and why Williams, who was always known as the calm, respectful presence on set, is now finally speaking more openly than ever before. Because the truth about the relationship between Hal Williams and Demond Wilson is not what most people think. And once you hear what Williams has revealed about the atmosphere on that set, the tensions between certain cast members, and the unspoken realities of working on one of the first all-black sitcoms in America, you will never watch Sanford and Son the same way again. For decades, Sanford and Son has been remembered as a groundbreaking sitcom that changed television forever. It was loud, funny, raw, and unapologetically black at a time when very few shows dared to be. Viewers saw Fred Sanford's sarcasm, Lamont's frustration, and the hilarious chaos that unfolded in that junkyard house every week. What they did not see was the very different reality unfolding when the cameras stopped rolling. Now, with Demond Wilson's passing, Hal Williams stands as one of the last living voices who witnessed it all from the inside. Not from rumors, not from tabloids, but from the actual set, day after day, episode after episode, for years. And what he has shared over time paints a much more complicated picture of the environment behind one of the most beloved sitcoms in history. This video is going to take you through that reality step by step. We will look at how Williams described the work atmosphere as a party for some, but a stressful battleground for others. We will explore why Wilson had well-documented tensions with certain co-stars, yet maintained a steady, respectful relationship with Williams. And we will uncover how being part of one of the first nearly all-black casts on television came with pressures that audiences never knew existed. By the end of this video, you will understand not just the friendship between Hal Williams and Demond Wilson, but also the hidden truths about the Sanford and Son set that explain why their relationship was so different from the rest. When Hal Williams first stepped onto the Sanford and Son set in the early 1970s, he was not walking into an ordinary sitcom job. He was walking into what would later be called a television revolution in progress. At the time, very few shows centered almost entirely around black characters. Even fewer allowed those characters to be loud, flawed, funny, and unapologetically themselves. Sanford and Son was not polished. It was not cautious. It felt real. And Williams immediately sensed that this was not going to be like any production he had worked on before. He would later describe the set atmosphere as something closer to a neighborhood gathering than a formal workplace. There was laughter everywhere. Improvisation happened constantly. Conversations felt natural. According to Williams, he and Howard Platt, who played Officer Hoppy, often joked that they were getting paid to have fun. The chemistry was so organic that many scenes barely needed rehearsal to feel authentic. But what made this environment unique also made it unpredictable. Williams noticed very quickly that Red Foxx, the star of the show, had his own way of doing things. Foxx was a legendary stand-up comic before television, and he brought that same energy onto the set. He often skipped rehearsals, preferred to work off instinct, and trusted his timing over scripts. Somehow, when the cameras rolled, everything came together letter perfect, as Williams described it. To an outside observer, it might have looked chaotic, but to Williams, it felt alive. Then there was Demond Wilson. Unlike Foxx, Wilson came from a background that valued structure, preparation, and professionalism. He took the craft seriously, approached scenes with discipline, and often felt the weight of carrying a show that was becoming a cultural symbol for Black America. While Foxx floated through the set with comedic ease, Wilson was grounding himself in the responsibility of the role. And right here, in this contrast between two very different working styles, was the first sign of the tension that many viewers would never know existed. Williams, positioned as Officer Smitty, found himself observing this dynamic from a unique angle. He was not at the center of the storm, but he was close enough to see how differently the two leads viewed the job. One treated it like an extension of stand-up comedy, the other treated it like a mission. Yet what surprised Williams most was not the difference between Foxx and Wilson. It was how naturally he and Wilson connected from the very beginning. While Wilson would later have widely known tensions with other cast members, his relationship with Williams was steady, respectful, and drama-free. They spoke often, shared ideas, and understood each other in a way that did not require performance. There was no competition, No ego clash, no struggle for attention. And that quiet bond would become one of the most important, yet least talked about relationships behind the scenes of Sanford and Son. Because as the show grew bigger, the pressure inside that studio grew heavier. As Sanford and Son exploded in popularity, something changed inside the studio that Hal Williams could not ignore. What began as a loose, joyful, almost carefree environment slowly started to feel heavier. The laughter was still there. The improvisation was still happening. But behind the smiles, there was a growing awareness among the cast that they were no longer just actors on a sitcom. They had become symbols. Sanford and Son was now being discussed in newspapers, magazines, and television reviews as a breakthrough for Black representation in America. Audiences across the country were watching Fred and Lamont not just for comedy, but for what they represented. For many Black families, this was the first time they saw a household on television that felt familiar, unfiltered, and honest. That kind of attention brought pride. But it also brought pressure. Williams later reflected that Demond Wilson felt this pressure more than most. While Red Foxx leaned into his comedic instincts and trusted his decades of stage experience, Wilson was deeply aware that his performance carried meaning beyond entertainment. He was portraying a young Black man navigating life with an older father, struggling with money, responsibility, and dignity. To Wilson, this was not just acting. It was representation, and representation is heavy. Williams noticed that Wilson took rehearsals seriously, wanted scenes to land correctly, and sometimes grew frustrated when things felt too loose or chaotic. He wanted the show to be respected, not just laughed at. He wanted it to be remembered as meaningful, not sloppy. At the same time, Foxx's relaxed, improvisational style often clashed with that mindset. Foxx believed the magic happened in spontaneity. Wilson believed the magic came from preparation. Neither man was wrong. But their approaches were completely different. Williams found himself in the middle, watching this contrast unfold day after day. As Officer Smitty, his role was often that of a mediator on screen, stepping between Fred and Lamont during arguments. Ironically, off-screen, he sometimes felt like he understood both sides of a similar dynamic. He could appreciate Foxx's comedic genius while also respecting Wilson's seriousness about the craft. This is where Williams' relationship with Wilson deepened. They would talk between takes. Not about gossip, not about drama, but about the responsibility of what they were doing, about how rare it was to be part of a show with an almost entirely Black cast at a time when Hollywood was not built to support that, about how careful they had to be even when the script called for chaos. Williams later shared that Wilson often spoke about wanting the show to have dignity beneath the humor. He did not want Sanford and Son to become a caricature of Black life. He wanted it to be funny, yes, but also human. And as the show climbed the ratings, that concern grew stronger. Because the bigger the show became, the less control the actors felt they had over how it was perceived. Writers, producers, and network executives began paying closer attention. Expectations rose, deadlines tightened, and the carefree environment that Williams once described as a party started to feel like a high-pressure workplace where every scene mattered more than before. But here is what most fans never realized. While Wilson was feeling this weight, Williams remained one of the few people on set who could calm the situation simply by being himself. His steady personality, easygoing nature, and lack of ego made him someone Wilson trusted, someone he could talk to without feeling judged or misunderstood. And this quiet friendship stood in sharp contrast to the growing tensions Wilson was experiencing with others, because as the pressure mounted, not everyone on that set was handling it the same way. And the differences in how they coped would soon lead to the fractures that fans would later hear about for decades. By the time Sanford and Son reached the height of its popularity, stories about tension between Demond Wilson and other cast members were already beginning to circulate. Over the years, interviews, memoirs, and retrospectives would confirm that Wilson's working relationship with Red Foxx and Nathaniel Taylor was not always smooth. But through all of it, one name never appeared in those stories: Hal Williams. And that is not a coincidence. Williams' personality was fundamentally different from the others on set. He was not chasing the spotlight. He was not trying to compete for attention. He was not invested in who got the biggest laugh or who controlled the rhythm of a scene. He came to work, delivered his role, enjoyed the moment, and went home without carrying the emotional weight of the set with him. For Wilson, this was refreshing, because while others brought strong personalities, big egos, or unpredictable energy into the studio, Williams brought stability. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he reacted, And that created a space where Wilson could relax without feeling like he had to defend his position or prove himself. Williams once explained that he never felt the need to insert himself into the conflicts around him. He understood that Foxx had his style. He understood that Wilson had his. Instead of choosing sides, he simply respected both as professionals trying to do their jobs in different ways. That neutrality is what protected his relationship with Wilson. They were able to talk openly without the conversations turning into debates about how the show should be run. They shared something deeper than workplace chatter. They shared the understanding that they were part of history in the making, and that realization bonded them in a quiet way. Another key factor was how their characters functioned on screen. Officer Smitty was often the calm presence who stepped into chaotic situations involving Fred and Lamont. In many episodes, Smitty acted as a mediator, the voice of reason, when arguments escalated. That same energy carried off screen. Williams naturally embodied the same temperament as his character. Wilson appreciated that. Because when he was dealing with stress, frustration, or exhaustion from the pressures of the show, Williams did not fuel those emotions. He diffused them. He reminded Wilson, sometimes without even trying, that the job could still be enjoyable. There was no competition between them because their roles did not overlap. Wilson was a lead. Williams was a supporting character with a strong presence but without the burden of carrying the show. That difference allowed their friendship to exist without the tension that often comes when actors feel they are fighting for the same space. And this is something Williams later recognized with clarity. He realized that the reason he and Wilson remained close was because their relationship was never built on the show's hierarchy. It was built on mutual respect, as two Black actors navigating an industry that was still learning how to handle a show like Sanford and Son. They talked about breaking barriers, about how rare it was to be in a cast that Red Fox once called the National Black Company. They understood that what they were doing would open doors for future generations of actors, even if they did not fully feel the impact at the time. But as this bond grew stronger, the environment around them continued to shift, because the tensions Wilson had with others were not disappearing. They were becoming more visible. And while Williams stayed out of the conflict, he could not ignore what was happening just a few feet away from him on that same legendary set. As the seasons of Sanford and Son went on, the energy inside the studio was no longer as light as it had been in the beginning. The jokes were still sharp. The audience still laughed loudly. The show still dominated ratings. But behind the curtain, the emotional atmosphere had changed in ways that only the people standing on that set every day could truly understand. How Williams could feel it. He later reflected that there were days when you could sense the tension before anyone even spoke. Not because people were arguing openly, but because of how differently each person was carrying the pressure of the show's success. Damon Wilson, by this point, was visibly feeling the weight of responsibility. He wanted professionalism. He wanted consistency. He wanted the show to be taken seriously. Meanwhile, Red Fox continued to operate from instinct, charisma, and improvisation, often arriving without rehearsing and trusting his natural timing to carry scenes. To the audience, it looked seamless. To the cast, it sometimes felt unstable. Williams described how Fox's unpredictable approach could be both brilliant and stressful at the same time. When it worked, it created television magic. When it didn't, it created frustration for actors who depended on timing and structure to deliver their lines properly. Wilson was one of those actors. This is where many of the well-documented tensions between Wilson and Foxx began to take root. Not from personal dislike, but from two completely opposite philosophies about how the job should be done. Williams watched this from a close distance. He understood why Wilson was frustrated. He also understood why Foxx refused to change. And because he understood both sides, he never allowed himself to be pulled into the emotional current that was building between them. But the tension was not limited to just the two leads. As the show grew, so did egos, expectations, and outside pressures from producers and executives. There were disagreements about direction, about workload, about how the show was being handled behind the scenes. And while much of this never reached the public in full detail, the cast felt it every single day. Williams later shared that what made it difficult was not the arguments themselves, but the fact that everyone still had to step in front of a live audience and make it look effortless. They had to be funny. They had to be energetic. They had to make people laugh, even on days when the atmosphere backstage felt tense and emotionally draining. That takes a toll. And this is where Williams's role became quietly important in a way fans never noticed. Because while others were feeling the strain, Williams remained steady. He stayed consistent. He kept the mood light when he could. He refused to let the stress change how he interacted with his co-stars. For Wilson especially, this stability became something he leaned on more than people realized. Williams did not try to fix the problems, he simply made sure he was not adding to them. He understood that sometimes the best way to support someone is not by confronting the chaos, but by being the calm presence in the middle of it. But even Williams could see that this environment was wearing Wilson down over time. And the longer the show ran, the clearer it became that something was building inside Wilson that would eventually lead him to step away from this world altogether. A decision that years later would shock fans and reshape how people looked back at his time on Sanford and Son. When Sanford and Son finally came to an end, the public saw it as the close of a wildly successful sitcom. Reruns would play for decades. New generations would discover Fred and Lamont. The laughter would never fade. But for the people who lived through it, especially Demond Wilson, the ending meant something deeper. Wilson gradually stepped away from Hollywood, eventually dedicating himself to ministry and a quieter life away from the spotlight. For many fans, this seemed sudden and mysterious. But for Hal Williams, it made perfect sense. He had watched the emotional toll the show had taken on Wilson. He had seen how seriously Wilson carried the responsibility of representation, professionalism, and legacy. He had witnessed how the constant tension between different working styles, combined with the weight of being part of a cultural milestone, slowly drained the joy out of the experience for him. Williams understood that Wilson did not walk away because he hated the show. He walked away because he had given everything he had to it. And he needed peace. Over the years, as stories about Sanford and Son were retold in interviews and documentaries, Williams remained one of the few voices who spoke about the set with balance. He never exaggerated the conflicts. He never denied that tension existed. He simply described it as the reality of strong personalities working under historic pressure. And now, after Wilson's passing on January 30th, 2026, Williams stands in a unique position that no one could have predicted decades ago. He is the last living actor from the show's recurring cast who appeared in more than 20 episodes, the last direct link to the daily reality of that set, the last person who can speak not from rumor, not from headlines, but from memory. Fans have begun to look at him differently, not just as Officer Smitty, but as the living memory of what Sanford and Son truly was behind the scenes. Through his reflections, we learned that the show was not simply a comedy. It was a groundbreaking experiment carried by human beings with different personalities, different pressures, and different ways of coping with fame and responsibility. We learned that Demond Wilson was not just Lamont Sanford. He was a man deeply committed to doing things the right way, even when the environment around him made that difficult. And we learned that Hal Williams' quiet, steady presence was one of the reasons that Wilson always had at least one person on that set he could trust without reservation. Today, when Williams speaks about those years, there is no bitterness, no scandalous accusations, no dramatic revelations, just honest insight into how complicated and meaningful that experience really was. And that honesty is what changes how we see Sanford and Son forever. Because behind the laughter was pressure. Behind the jokes was responsibility. Behind the scenes was a friendship built on respect in the middle of tension that few people ever truly understood.